given everything that's going on in the world today, we've wanted to get somebody that's truly knowledgeable on geopolitical issues. I don't know if you guys know this. There's quite a bit going on. We're just joking. Probably need to check our phone right now because every 10 minutes your things could categorically change. We're honored here to have with us Dr. Stephen Long. He's an associate professor of political science and global studies at the University of Richmond. Excuse me. Dr. Long's expertise lies in international relations and American foreign policy, with a particular focus on the causes of war, rivalries, and the dynamics of victory and defeat. His research also delves into diversionary theories of war and alliance politics. Dr. Long's distinguished career includes recognition in the Princeton Review's 300 Best Professors, as well as the University of Richmond's Advising Excellence Award and International Educator Award. Not to mention, he currently serves as the senior editor of the Oxford Encyclopedia of International Studies. It's a pretty big deal. Today, Dr. Long will guide us through critical global challenges, including Iran's nuclear program, the ongoing Ukraine war, the complexities of the South China Sea dispute, and the evolving situation surrounding Taiwan. So, without further ado, Dr. Long.
Okay, let's see. If I walk away, can you hear me on the speakers at all? No. I'm not sure if that part's working, but I think this definitely is. Yeah, okay, better. So thank you very much for the introduction. The academic world is a very small one, so to hear being an editor at an academic journal described as a big deal is humorous even to me. Our total of maybe 500 regular readers, I would think, are impressed by the title. Now, I come to you from the beautiful green campus of the University of Richmond, right down the way here. Of course, this is the quiet time of the year for us, where we just have we have about 800 or 900 students that are on campus, but they're all doing summer research projects, and it's a much slower pace. So this is a good time to visit the campus if you haven't been over there lately. It's basically a park for the community in the summers. We also have a brand new burial ground memorial for slaves who were part of building the university grounds. And we only discovered this in our history 5 or 6 years ago. So it's actually quite a beautiful memorial, which is, I guess, behind. It's kind of down the street from the Robbins School of Business. You just keep going down the same road. In any case, we're always building, and we're always enjoying our students there. And the thing about teaching students, though, is that they have very little life experience. They really don't know anything about anything. They have raw horsepower, very quick brains, and they learn quickly, but they don't have any experience. So I really love coming out in the community and speaking to groups like yours to talk with people who've seen a little bit more of the world and how it works. So I really appreciate the invitation. It's nice to talk to adults. So we have a lot to cover. Obviously, times are quite hectic, both in domestic politics in the US and in international affairs and US foreign policy. So I'm going to cover a good bit of ground. I'll probably have to flip through slides pretty quickly to show you visuals, but don't worry about needing to read everything on a slide. I'm going to go over all of it just verbally, but people learn differently, so I try to do both things. And to give you an overview of what we're going to do, we're going to start with talking about the war that's ongoing in Ukraine, then we'll move on to the nuclear weapons programs in North Korea and Iran. We're going to talk about the South China Sea dispute. Then, of course, the dispute over Taiwan. And then we'll wrap up with some broader challenges for the United States in tackling and responding to and even keeping track of all of these threats simultaneously. Joseph Nye, who was an American professor who went into the policy world during the Clinton years. He became one of the assistant secretaries of state. He said that the policy world is like trying to take a sip from a fire hose because there are so many things coming at you all at once. And he said he literally had no time once he got in the job to learn anything new. All he could do was respond as quickly as possible to each thing coming in. So the US has some limitations in what we can do when all of this is going on and more. I could have 5 more bullet points on AI or any number of other things. It's hard to keep ourselves on top of all of these matters. So let's talk about Ukraine first. I'm sure you all remember the general history of this conflict, which really began in 2008, not 2022. Right? 2008 was really the beginning of Russian incursions into its near abroad, which is not just Ukraine, but also the Republic of Georgia, where it has been probing, kind of in the old style of Soviet-American relations. And there is a pretty good parallel there, since Putin himself was a former KGB head. They have been probing into their near abroad, their neighboring states, to determine the strength and the commitment levels of those neighboring states and also their allies. And we haven't seen them actually probe into NATO members, but Ukraine is one country over. Hopefully that stabilizes. Okay, but the war that we're all looking at now really opened in 2022, when, as you recall, Russia, using Belarus and its own border with Ukraine, moved very quickly into these red areas that are contested. All of this area of northern and eastern Ukraine was quickly taken either by Russian forces or by pro-Russian militias inside of Ukraine, because Ukraine has a pretty sizable Russian ethnic minority. Although I will say, I don't have time to go through the details, but the concept of ethnicity is a moving target, especially in Ukraine. And so everyone was taught Russian, for instance, under the Soviet system. People started to identify themselves as ethnically Russian. Nowadays, if you ask if you're ethnically Russian, it's only about 10% of the population who will say yes anymore. And they are all the same people who used to say yes before. So we can't really say there are a bunch of Russian ethnicity folks in these areas, but there are pro-Russian militias. And so they declared themselves independent in this kind of southeastern part of Ukraine, while Russian forces, traditional armed forces, moved in the east and the north. And this was meant to be a quick war of what tacticians call maneuver, right? Where you take important pieces of territory, you try to get around your enemy. Things like pincer movements or encirclement are a bit of an obsession in Russian military doctrine. Ever since World War II, they've been obsessed with encirclement and pincer movements. And so they thought they would come into the north and they would quickly encircle Kyiv and then force out Mr. Zelensky and replace him with their former Russian kind of puppet figure who was president in Ukraine before Zelensky. They even brought him to Belarus to prepare him to go in victoriously to Kyiv and declare a new government. The Ukrainians had different ideas, as we all discovered watching them successfully defend Kyiv, and grind the whole Russian offensive to a halt by just 1 month into the war. And over relatively short period of time, just a few months, we saw the Ukrainian national forces push the Russians all the way back across the Belarusian border and all the way across the original border with Russia, all the way down to where we are here by 2023. And really, they've retaken significant portions of Ukrainian territory, as you can see, and there's ongoing partisan activity within the areas that Russia still claims. But this has turned largely by 2023 into the war that we know now, which we call a war of attrition, right? Of just blasting the opponent for as long as you can and trying to hold up your forces and your morale and throwing men into the fight. But we learned a lot during 2023. Russia revealed itself to be fighting in a very old-fashioned form of combat, really learned and perfected during the Cold War, and it revealed significant weaknesses in everything from field tactics, how to take a hill, how to take a position, to logistics, supplying their forces in the field, to operational plans, understanding, well, if we want to win the war, which cities do we need to take first? Where should the campaign be focused? What should be the primary front? They made mistake after mistake after mistake. And this left a lot of Western analysts truly puzzled, because by the numbers, Russia should have won quite quickly. I was on a panel in, I think, the second week of the war, and it was me, it was a European politics professor, there was a Russian politics professor, and an anthropologist. And the Russian politics professor and I disagreed on what the chances were that Ukraine would be able to hold out until NATO could actually mobilize meaningful support. And I thought I was being really optimistic by saying that I thought they could last a few months. And he was thinking another week or two, max. And we were both really wrong, and most analysts were wrong. NATO wasn't expecting this to go as well as it did in the early months. I think even the Ukrainians were surprised. Certainly the Russians were. But what we saw was a failure to think in long-term planning for supplying the troops. We had armored columns actually running out of gas on the offensive in the northern part of Ukraine. We had soldiers who were really not very well trained, failing to obey orders in the field, retreating, panicking in the field, allowing themselves to get surrounded when they really had the advantage in numbers and firepower. It became kind of this mythical quality of some of the Ukrainian units in the minds of the Russians. Kind of ironic, because in World War II, from May 1942 on, you see this kind of mythical quality for the Russian troops, right? The Germans were terrified of the Eastern Front, and now we have the Russians terrified of the Ukrainians in this case. And we also saw the flaws of a politically driven military. Russia, for years under Putin, has been cutting out the most competent generals in its military in favor of loyalists. And we saw the results of that by 2023. They just were not ready to fight a modern war. And it was a massive strategic failure, because as you all know, we not only did not see NATO step back from influencing Ukraine, which was part of Putin's stated goal, he did not create a shield against NATO in the form of Ukraine, but he actually got an enlargement of NATO's borders with Russia itself, because Sweden and Finland joined. And the Finnish border alone is miles and miles of direct border with Russia. So it really backfired on Putin. It really has continued to be a terrible strategic blunder for him. And it has been a wake-up call for NATO. Right? If Putin had wanted a weaker NATO, more intimidated NATO, and a neutral zone between Russia and NATO, he's not getting any of those things. He's not getting the neutral zone. I think in the long term, he's not likely to keep all of the territory he has now within Ukrainian borders. And he's not getting an intimidated and weakened NATO at all. In fact, he's getting a reinvigorated NATO. Now, over time, it is true since the end of the Cold War, and even during the Cold War, defense spending by the members of NATO was declining. And this led to the big burden-sharing debate between the United States and the European members of NATO, which is the idea that the US was doing all the heavy lifting, right? That we were spending 4-5% of our GDP on defense, while our European allies were often spending below 2%, especially after the Cold War. See, all of these examples underneath the 2% threshold. And so I think rightfully President Trump in the first term put pressure on the Europeans to spend more. And whether it was him or whether it was what they were seeing on the ground in Ukraine, the Europeans did pay attention. And we can see now that their spending is ramping back up, and they're well underway toward reaching an average 2% target. Now, a lot of that is driven by the countries that are closest to Russia for obvious reasons. So Poland has really ramped up its spending. Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia have all ramped up their spending because they're a little concerned that they might be next. Estonia is devoting actually 40% of its military budget to aid to Ukraine. That's how serious a threat they perceive it to be, versus, say, American threat perception, where I think at this point, if you ask the average American, they might wonder, why are we still doing anything about Ukraine? How is it our business? Why is that something for us to be concerned with? They're not even a member of NATO. There are also some fascinating things happening, and as my introduction kindly noted, I'm interested in victory and defeat in warfare. I mostly study the political causes, things about political resolve and leadership, and not kind of the numbers part of warfare. But technology kind of bridges the gap a little bit between leadership and politics and tactics and on-the-ground fighting, because it can be used to replace manpower in certain scenarios. And that's exactly what we've seen Ukraine do since about 2024, early 2024. We see Ukraine really recognizing that it is running out of trained soldiers, that it is outnumbered still because Russia has a massive capacity to draft unwilling civilians to go to fight and scare them into doing it. Ukraine has a draft as well, but its supply of young men who aren't already in combat is dwindling. And so they kind of put their heads together and realized that there is a cheap alternative to traditional massed formation of men. There's even a cheap alternative to aerial bombing or artillery, and that is in the form of commercially available drones. We're not talking about predator drones like the United States that loiter at 10,000 or 15,000 feet for 24 hours before dropping a precise munition somewhere. We're talking about the kinds of drones that your kids, or that you, if you're a hobbyist, would be able to buy in the local hobby shop. They only carry maybe 20 pounds at most, and they're completely disposable if you are a state making these purchases. So Ukraine has innovated immensely with these drones, and I'm sure you all saw the news of the most recent big attack deep into Russian territory. Now, that's a puzzle to me a little bit because the drones certainly don't have that range. And rumors are that it was trucks that were brought in without being detected. Can't imagine being the drivers of one of those trucks going deep into Russia. And then the drones come up out of the cargo area of the truck. It sounds like a suicidal mission to me, but that appears to be what they did. And they're using them in lots of interesting ways. They're using them the way the United States has intended to use small drones, which is to provide surveillance overhead so that a unit can, say, go to sleep and not worry about being ambushed. They just need one guy to stay up on enhanced watch, not just watching what he can see and hear, but watching what the drone can see and hear. And that way they know that they're safe. They can use it for reconnaissance over enemy positions. They can use it for targeting artillery strikes. All of these are happening all the way down to the platoon level without the need for a lot of high-level commanders to be involved. They have given their lower-level troops a lot of freedom to use their initiative. So platoon-level units are walking around with 5, 6, 7, 8 drone units. And I don't know if you've seen how they fly them, but it's all in the first-person view. The pilot has the controls, and then they have those kind of augmented reality goggles that allow them to see everything from the viewpoint of the drone itself. And they're trained to do this, but it only takes a week to be able to figure out how to be a pretty good pilot of a drone in that format. Not quite like teaching them to fly our F-16s. And their typical tactic is to send them out in pairs. They send one out in advance to surveil the position and give overwatch and pay attention to what's going on in the position while the one that's carrying the weapon comes up behind. Then the one that's carrying the weapon comes up, goes and hits a direct strike. It's destroyed in the process, and the observation drone documents the results and flies back home. Right? Pretty smart approach. And as I said, these are all consumer-level drones. We're not really selling them the big boys, and we don't need to. In fact, the big boys wouldn't work. The Predator drones wouldn't be right for what they're trying to do because they want them to be disposable and move into very small spaces. So a typical assembly would be a drone like this. This is probably a DJI or DJI Mavic commercially available drone with 4 rotors. Then you take your pre-existing artillery warhead. You don't even have to design anything specific for the drone and basically strap it to the bottom of the thing. That's what one looks like in real life. Takes off from a set of bricks. And I don't think the video will work, but you can find these online if you're interested. The first-person view of these drone strikes is quite amazing. The one that is in this video that I'm not going to be able to play because of the way the slides are working, that lower video shows the drone being piloted down and then laterally, almost at ground level, into the opening of a hangar where a Russian tank is being maintained. It has one of its little viewports in the front open, and the drone not only flies into the building, but flies into the viewport and explodes inside the tank. Right? And no Ukrainian soldiers are put at risk during any of those operations. Yeah?
What is like the range on that? And what is it? On that attack, you said, I guess it's like 5 feet, but like, what do they normally take off at? How many feet up or whatever?
They can fly in the hundreds of feet, but not in the thousands of feet. They're also very small, right? So you can sometimes hear them, and there are jammers that the Russians and Ukrainians can use to try to intercept the signals that are communicating with these little drones. But they get through, by and large, they get through enemy detection.
I'm curious, like how far away was that attack called in from?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I would say within a couple miles. Yeah. These are largely along the front. I predict that. Sometimes I like my own slides when they surprise me like that. So it's largely along the front, right, where the units themselves are pretty close to where the drones are striking. To do something a little further back, like these Russian drone attacks into the interior of Ukraine, they would have to be more like our American hunter-killer drones, or they would have to have some way that they've infiltrated the country itself. But by and large, they're happening along the lines of combat. Purple indicate Ukrainian attacks, orange indicate Russian attacks, and if I recall, we're reaching about 70,000 drone attacks in the war so far. Think about how many artillery strikes that would be, how many infantry missions that would be, how many soldiers would be lost pulling off those same attacks if it weren't for drones. Yes.
So I'm assuming the Russians are now using this technology as well. So
They are.
your Russian drone attack, Ukrainian drone attack, it's these smaller drones. I guess
Yes.
the Russians, it can also be the...
Yes, they're improvising as well. I would say they're not improvising as quickly or as effectively as the Ukrainians, right? As I said, the command structure of the Russian military is still very much a Cold War model. It's very hierarchical, with only the people at the very top really authorized to make decisions. We see this in other authoritarian regimes as well. If you look at North Korea or Iran or Iraq before the war, political loyalty is the first criteria for becoming a high-level officer. And everybody on the ground is afraid to act too much without orders from above. Whereas, in the American military, troops are given the broad objectives and they're asked to take the initiative when it's appropriate. They're not supposed to call to Washington every time they want to take a hill. Yes.
Do you know of any current U.S. support in terms of intelligence for the Ukrainians for weapons?
Yes. Yes. The United States is providing assistance via Poland. It is providing a good bit of American military equipment, including F-16s, and also intelligence support. So we are cooperating with the Ukrainian intelligence services. Yes, that was a short-lived step back from providing aid. But you may recall that that minerals deal that the president was asking for, it eventually did go through, and so he lifted the gates on aid to Ukraine again. I think our reputation suffered a hit, right? It's a very transactional way of thinking about an alliance. But from Ukraine's view, however it gets to them is fine. And so they are receiving American support. About half of the support Ukraine receives, though, is from the rest of NATO. And I will say, someone might ask me this, isn't it expensive? Well, yes. Yes, it is. But about 2/3 of the money that the United States gives to Ukraine gets spent on American equipment supplied by American manufacturers. So it's money that's coming back largely to our own economy. Right? It doesn't just disappear.
I just ask one question about how big is that shaded area in landmass? Is that Rhode Island? Is that Virginia? Is that California?
Not California, but not Rhode Island. Bigger than a toaster, but no, I couldn't give you the square miles. If you want the detailed battlefront reports, I recommend the Institute for the Study of War, which is headquartered at Columbia University. They do a daily map, a geolocated daily map where they identify the locations of the fronts and the troops from both sides using the metadata on photographs that are posted by soldiers with their cell phones. There are no secret attacks anymore in this age. There are no secret attacks because everybody on the battlefield has their cell phone. Right? And unless they turn them off, GPS coordinates are being given to the providers. If they take a photo, the location is tagged automatically. Right? A lot of our intelligence about the original invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and not original because that was Crimea, but the big beginning of the war, a lot of the intelligence the US used to know it was coming was from Russian civilians who took pictures of the military trucks going down the highway. Like, this is weird. Click, 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 click. The surprise is over. No more surprises. Because the population is paying attention and taking photographs of everything. We even identified enemy troop formations in the backgrounds of selfies. I mean, this is not science fiction anymore. In fact, just from the background of any photograph outdoors, it's pretty easy to use AI to identify the location. Okay, the attacks this past week, as you see, they are not right along the battlefront. Battlefront's down here, right? They hit major air bases deep into Russia. And again, as I said, that's part drone and part probably espionage. Right? Successfully getting trucks across Russian borders. You have to believe there are some sympathizers in Russia and maybe even the Russian military that made that possible. I also believe there are sympathizers in the Russian military based on the intelligence that was shared with the United States and NATO before the war began. There was information about those exercises that could only have been known by people on the other side. That's not to say we should expect anything more of them. They're not going to overturn Putin or anything like that. But there are supporters out there that think this war is incorrect for Russia. And Russia is getting worn down. Circa 2025, Russia is declining in its advantages, its traditional advantage in manpower, because it's drafting more and more unsuitable conscripts to its military, everyone from prisoners to the elderly, to people who have physical handicaps, They're bringing them in by force into the military, but they are unwilling participants. Whenever anyone tells me, oh, we should have a universal draft, everyone should have the sense of service, I'm pretty sure commanding officers don't want a bunch of people who don't want to be there and who are going to give them trouble when they're given commands. And that's what Russia's facing now. A bunch of, as my mom would say, ne'er-do-wells and layabouts. These are people who are not eager to serve. They're looking for opportunities to escape. They're going to ignore orders. They may not fire when they're asked to, et cetera, et cetera. And Russia's losing its bomber fleet gradually to Ukrainian air defenses, which are quite capable, and also to Ukrainian attacks on airfields. They have been wise in targeting the air power of Russia because it still has not quite air superiority, but Ukraine does not have air superiority either at this point. So it's smart to focus on Russian air power, where they have a big advantage. And we've seen they're even running out of ammunition. That's why suddenly Russia has a very cozy relationship with North Korea and Iran. They have historic ties to both places, but have seen them both as troublemakers in the past that they didn't want to get too cozy with. And now they're buying large stockpiles of ammunition, artillery shells and such. And even as you may have heard on the news, North Korean soldiers are in the field in Ukraine. We know it's not just a rumor because they've been captured by the Ukrainians. I'm kind of shocked that they didn't defect. That's a good opportunity if you're North Korean. But I imagine they have families at home. All right. And despite talk about how expensive it is, the reality is that NATO as a whole vastly outclasses Russia economically and in terms of defense spending and wherewithal to continue this fight indefinitely. Russia cannot do that. It does not have the capacity, even without all the sanctions that are in place. It cannot carry this war out indefinitely against a unified NATO. We don't have to send troops to win. Just have to keep doing what we are doing, and gradually we will outlast them.
What kind of time frame are you thinking?
Years, not months, years. I mean, I would be surprised if we do stick with this attrition strategy, if we do stick with kind of keeping some limits on what Ukraine is allowed to do, I suspect we're talking about at least 3 more years. Right? Putin's put a lot of his eggs in this basket. It's getting harder and harder for the Russian public not to be aware that the war is going badly, especially when things are blowing up in their backyards. I think he needs to find a way to extract himself in a way that he can call it a win, and we're not quite there yet.
Black Sea still demilitarized, and are wheat exports flowing from Ukraine?
Say the first part?
Is the Black Sea demilitarized now?
Yes. Yes, and wheat's flowing, but I mean, they really just have one major port to export it out of. Yes, I mean, Ukraine is a breadbasket of a country, but there are routinely problems with shipments getting out on time. I mean, the Ukrainian economy is hurting. There's no way around that. It's kind of stunning that it's not worse, though. Right? If I were Russia, I would be focused on the electrical grid, on the sewage treatment plants, on the freshwater supplies. I would be hitting the population. I mean, I'd be a bad person for doing it, but I'd be hitting the population where it hurts. It's shocking that Ukraine has any airfields. It's shocking that the electrical grid works. It's shocking that people can go to cafes and just have normal days. If you're Russia, and this is really a serious fight, I'm amazed that they're not doing more. It alarms me a little bit because it means there are a lot of additional steps that Russia can take to make this war worse. Right now, they're focused on attrition against the Ukrainian military. But the third strategy of warfare is called punishment. And it is punishment of the civilian population. And they haven't really gotten started on that. Okay. I'm going to keep moving because we do have other conflicts to deal with, but I'll be a bad political scientist and give you a prediction. I shouldn't give predictions, but you can't hold me to it. My prediction would be that Ukraine continues to grow its technological advantages. It will innovate as quickly as it has, and Russia will have a very difficult time pivoting toward a doctrine that would be suitable for this war. They just don't have the know-how in their command structure in the military, because all of those competent people have been purged. Right? Remember, like Stalin after World War II, right? Purging anyone who would be competent enough to develop a following that might be a threat to your hold on power. Right? In the American military, we don't worry that, say, Dempsey or someone like that has thousands of troops that deeply connect their identity to having served under him. Right? And we're crying when he finally retired from service at the ceremony. We don't worry about that because he's not like a challenger to the government of the United States. We're happy that our generals can elicit that kind of loyalty and personal tie. Right? Putin's Russia would see that as a major threat. And Dempsey would have been tossed out a window somewhere at some point. So, Ukraine is fighting in a smart way that I think is sustainable, more sustainable than the way that Russia is fighting this war. And I think it's becoming more and more obvious to Russians in everyday life that this is not a quick military exercise. It's not a quick kind of righteous invasion of some Nazi state, as Putin accused Ukraine of being, which is very strange terminology in this case. But it goes a long way back in Ukrainian history in World War II. In any case, I don't think they can hold that up, and I think as long as NATO stays resolute and stays relatively unified, there's no chance that Russia can win this in the long term. The only way Putin wins is if we decide that we've had enough and we hand it to him on a silver platter.
Before we move on.
Yeah.
I may have missed this. What is, in your mind,
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
well, what's Putin's goal with all this? It seems like,
Well, yeah.
Why does he want Ukraine? Does it stop Ukraine if he had his way?
Yeah, I've had to have this argument many times with students who kind of come in with the mindset that Putin is evil, right? He's Hitler or Mussolini, or Pol Pot or whatever. And I don't think he is. I don't think he's evil. I don't think his aspirations are limitless. I think he's an opportunist, and he's incredibly good at sensing weakness. He's a realist, right? He wants to do what he can achieve without the cost being too high. He's not willing to sacrifice himself or his regime for some righteous cause that he envisions. I think, yes, the goal was to take all of Ukraine, but not to occupy it directly. The signs are that he wanted a puppet leader, maybe even allow them to continue to have democratic elections, but only if they elect pro-Russian leaders. I think that's what he was looking for with Ukraine. He saw it as a buffer. He wanted to make sure it would not join NATO and it would not join the EU. That was the goal with Ukraine. Going further into NATO does not seem to make sense to me, but I don't blame Poland and Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania for seeing that a bit differently. It's easy for me to say they're not under threat. But if he had won the war in Ukraine, I can totally understand why they would perceive themselves to be under threat. And he has made the same claims about Latvia that he made about Ukraine, which is that the local government is suppressing the rights of Russian speakers. This is such a dumb story, really, at the beginning, because it's a bad lie on his part. Putin doesn't lie well. He doesn't care that the lie is believable or not. Right? It's almost insulting to our intelligence the way he lies. Not even good. Give me a good story. But he doesn't do that. He says Russian speakers were being oppressed because Ukraine was going to stop teaching Russian language as a primary language in school. Invade, right? I mean, that doesn't make sense, but that was his claim. And he also has made that claim about Latvia, that Russian speakers in Latvia are being oppressed, and that they're ethnic Russians. And again, ethnicity in Eastern Europe and Central Europe is really messy because we have decades of Soviet pro-Russian language policy in all of the peripheral states around Russia. So people may associate themselves with Russia because of the language and may even think they're ethnically Russian when they're not. But when it benefited you to have a Russian last name and to speak Russian, suddenly there are a lot more Russians on the ground. So it's a very strange story he's trying to weave. I can see why at least Latvia would be alarmed, but I don't really see the cold logic of going further than Ukraine. Really don't see it. But, don't take my word for it. I do think he's rational in the end. If he wasn't rational, then the nuclear threat, he could carry that out. Okay, we've talked a lot about Ukraine, and it's okay. We can talk about what we want to talk about. I will get to Iran and North Korea briefly because we've had some developments this week. You may recall the old story with Iran was, of course, that we believed since the early 2000s that it was pursuing nuclear weapons production. It is what we now call a latent nuclear weapons state, meaning that it has not built any warheads, but it has all of the technology, all of the facilities, and all of the supplies that it needs to build one. There's no need for additional inputs. It's just a matter of assembling the things, which they definitely know how to do, miniaturizing it, which they definitely know how to do, and putting it on top of a warhead, a missile, which they definitely know how to do. So this is the basis of Israel's ongoing estimate that Iran is 6 months away from having the bomb. Israel makes the assumption that Iran will make the decision to do it. But it continues to be 6 months away indefinitely until it decides to build one, which is why the Europeans and even the United States sometimes give longer timetables for when Iran might have a nuclear weapon. Israel is the most alarmed for obvious reasons. And then US is next most alarmed. And then the Europeans are third in line for how high their level of alarm is in terms of when they think this is likely to happen. In response to this program, the United States engaged with Iran under the Obama administration. It struck the so-called Iran nuclear deal, where they agreed to freeze enrichment. They also agreed to deactivate thousands of their centrifuges that were used for this process. They agreed to the strictest weapons inspections by UN personnel that any country has ever been under. And according to the IAEA, the inspection agency under the UN, they followed the deal. They followed the terms of the treaty. But our presidency changed, of course, and President Trump asserted that it was not a good deal, wasn't a good enough deal, and unilaterally pulled the United States out of it. And so after that, we ramped up more sanctions during the first Trump presidency. Biden tried to bring Iran back to the table, but failed to do so. And if you're Iran, you can kind of understand why they wouldn't want to make another deal, since the US backed away from the first one. Biden was not able to make that happen. And so the progress since then on the nuclear weapons program is that they've basically been able to rebuild their enriched stockpile of uranium. And we've seen escalating tensions between the United States and Iran, including the assassination by drone strike of a military general, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps leader, General Soleimani, in 2020. And we didn't do that when he was in Iran. We did it when he was in Iraq. And I think wisely on their part, Iran basically didn't respond to that. They were too concerned about escalation. We've also seen a cozying up between Russia and Iran over the past few years. Iran has been supplying weapons and ammunition, no troops, but weapons, ammunition, and so on, even actual bullets, to Russia to assist in the war in Ukraine. And you may have read the news today that they just struck a tentative deal for Russian scientists to help modernize some of Iran's nuclear reactors. Now, those are power reactors, but as I'll explain in a second, there's really no difference that's important between having a nuclear reactor and having a supply point for a weapons program. So, what are they doing now? They're escalating to enriching uranium through centrifuges, uranium gas, to the weapons-grade material of highly enriched uranium, above kind of the 20% threshold, well above the 5% threshold that the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty allows. They've engaged in continuing provocative attacks. They seized a South Korean ship that was floating by Iranian waters. They've conducted naval exercises with a mock-up of an Israeli ship and a base, trying to show that they could strike these things from some distance. They provided drones, ammunition, and artillery, as I said, to Russia. And their domestic politics are pretty fraught, which we know in political science studies, when you have a kind of tense domestic situation in authoritarian states, they tend to look for outside disputes that they can get involved in to rally the people around the flag, so to speak. That's the diversionary theory of war. So these are risky times. This week, there was a development that the Trump administration proposed to Iran through Egypt that perhaps we could strike a new nuclear deal with them. Strangely, we offered up pretty much everything they would want as our starting position, which I don't quite understand why we would kind of yield everything before we've even gotten a counteroffer from them. You want to go in tough, as any of you business folks would know. You want to go in tough and then work back to the deal that you'll find acceptable and hopefully advantageous. We agreed, or we offered to agree, that we would help them build nuclear power reactors. And again, there's no such thing as a nuclear reactor that can't be used for weapons research purposes. If they would stop all uranium enrichment again, pause it. But we didn't require that they disassemble anything, destroy any stockpiles. We're not even proposing that they adhere to that kind of requirement. We didn't do anything about their missile program, which is another source of problems with Iran. We didn't rope in any of their support for Hezbollah or their support for other terrorist organizations around the Middle East. There's nothing else in here. It's just very odd, because these points that I note as problems are all things that President Trump raised as a critique of the original deal. So if you want to fix the original deal, you have to deal with those things, and maybe it's forthcoming. All I have is one New York Times report of the proposal that was given to Egypt, which they got from Egyptian sources. So maybe there is more to it. I would hope there is. I would hope it's a tougher deal than that, or we're actually stepping back in our capacity to stop Iran from gaining nuclear weapons. And in any case, it doesn't deal with the underlying issue, that Iran has a threat perception that marks the United States as an existential threat, that marks Israel as an existential threat, and Iran is increasingly surrounded by opponents in the Arab world. We tend to think of this as a US-Iran thing, or a US-Israel-Iran thing, or an Israel-Iran thing. But as usual, we have a bit of our blinders on in terms of what other countries think about Iran. If you ask the Saudis what they think about Iran, they'll say they are our #1 security threat. And in fact, they're engaged in a proxy war against Iran right now in Yemen. They have been at odds since 1979. Iran is the Saudis' #1 strategic rival. way more serious a threat than Israel. And of course, we're allies with the Saudis ourselves. In fact, I suspect that if the Gaza war ends within this administration, we may even get to Saudi recognition of Israeli sovereignty, which would be an incredible change in the status of affairs in the Middle East. Right? The Saudis are on side with the US about this. They see Iran as a major threat. So do the Arab Emirates. So does Qatar. So do many other Gulf Arab states. So Iran is increasingly surrounded. It is backed into a corner. It cannot compete with its conventional military against all of those potential opponents. And so it is desperately striking out in the direction of nuclear weapons, the ultimate safeguard against invasion. Until we deal with that strategic problem and actually understand Iran's threat perception, we can make as many deals as we like. It's basically the same status quo. I was told that it wouldn't be the end of the world if I went a little bit over, but we need to have more time for questions. So let's see. Let me spin forward quickly. Okay, North Korea, same, getting stronger. And in the case of North Korea, we're largely ignoring it, which is to their advantage. The more we focus on Iran, the more we focus on Ukraine, the more we focus on Taiwan and China, the more North Korea gets to keep on doing its thing. There's a great story in The Onion in the form of a sad, plaintive letter from North Korea to the United States, like an angry boyfriend or girlfriend. Why don't you pay attention to me anymore? I have to act out and do more and more extreme things for you just to notice me. We never spent time together at talks anymore, right? That is North Korea's situation, which actually plays, as I said, plays to their advantage. I expect that they will continue to grow in power and capacity. They already have at least 100 nuclear weapons, and they're growing that arsenal. Strangely, it's possible that they will reach a point that will be competitive with China's arsenal in the next 10 years at the pace that they're moving. And very quickly, two other hot points in the world: the South China Sea, which has immense natural resources. And just yesterday, I read a headline indicating that CNOOC, which is China's national oil exploration company, has begun operating the first of 10 planned oil rigs in a portion of the South China Sea, which is not technically their territory, with the goal of pumping out 10,000 barrels of oil a day when it's at full capacity. China has many incentives to try to exert serious control over this region and has claimed it since the end of World War II against the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas. So they're claiming vastly more than international law would allow, and they're reinforcing those claims by literally building territory in the middle of it. These are artificial islands that China has moved from being reefs or atolls into air bases, so that now they can launch surveillance flights all around the South China Sea and force encounters with foreign navies and say, "Welcome to China, what's your business here?" Even though none of this territory is legally theirs. The mediation panel for the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea heard the case. China submitted its court case, and the Philippines, Vietnam, and the other claimants submitted their cases, and the court decided against China. Right? It has lost the legal dispute, and so it's just making it true physically instead. And this is their current ability to launch patrols in the South China Sea from those contested islands. So it makes perfect sense as a strategy. And amusingly, this whole time, they say that their goal is to make the South China Sea a sea of peace. It's interesting. There's a whole lot of aircraft landing strips and a couple aircraft carriers that don't look too peaceful that are in the South China Sea fleet. And just 2 days ago, the Chinese carrier, Liaoning, which is one of their two newest carriers, you may have seen it, has that kind of odd scoop shape at the end of the runway, kind of going up, the way American carriers do not. It's based on an old Russian design. It was spotted by Japan going past the second of the three island chains that the United States considers to be the kind of major choke points in the defense of the West Coast. Right, so American influence holds fast first at this island chain with our connections with Taiwan and our alliance with Japan and South Korea. The second chain goes out to Guam, American territory. The third chain is not visible here, but would be Hawaii, basically. This is the first time since the end of World War II that any Chinese vessel has gone beyond the second island chain, and that happened 2 days ago. I do suspect this is going to escalate. I think China is on an escalatory pattern. They're not just maintaining the status quo, they're pushing the status quo as far as they can. And it's getting hotter and hotter and hotter. We've seen Chinese ships spotted west of Guam before. We've never seen Chinese ships spotted east of Guam. And this is very much on purpose. These are not mistakes. I think the more distracted we are, the more appealing this kind of probing activity is by the Chinese. And then finally, Taiwan, the other probably most likely clash point between the US and China in the next 20 years, they're doing the same thing. This map shows Chinese mainland aerial incursions into what Taiwan considers to be its defensive zone, its air identification zone. They track them every year. We had a tripling of flights going into Taiwanese airspace in 2022 and 2023. It has ramped back down in 2024 for reasons unknown. But we've also seen changes in kind of the status quo with Taiwan that are alarming on both sides. China's launched these incursions, and on the other hand, the US has sold new types of military technology to Taiwan that used to be out of bounds. And we've made direct diplomatic visits, everything short of the president. We've made direct diplomatic visits to Taiwan, which we do not officially recognize as an independent state. It's in this weird limbo of not being China, but not being independent. It has a building full of American diplomats in it, but it's not an embassy. It's the American Institute. And technically, all of those State Department diplomats are on vacation while they work there to maintain the facade. And the part that scares me the most is that China is trying to overcome its tactical problems that it would face trying to invade Taiwan. There are very narrow beaches in Taiwan, very high waves in the Taiwan Straits. I had a US colonel tell me that it would be difficult for even him to plan an invasion of Taiwan because of how tricky the landings would be. And there are tons of natural choke points in mountainous territory of Taiwan where you could easily defend against traditional masses of troops. Well, they don't have the amphibious landing capabilities that the United States has, so they've improvised. They're calling this a landing barge. Just sits a little bit offshore and builds a ramp that takes you onto the beaches. Right? These are new this year. There is no logical use for these things except to take Taiwan. Now, this could be saber-rattling to showing they could, but I'm concerned. The Chinese military. Yeah, the Navy, Chinese Navy. Theoretically, yeah. I mean, you know, yeah, it's a strange model, but it shows that they're really thinking about what it would take. There are other things too. It's complicated, of course, but Like they've shown that they can shoot down a satellite in space from the ground. They're the third country to be able to do that behind the US and Russia, which the reason they're doing that is to show that they could take down the American GPS system if they needed to. Right? They're investing in the things that target the United States. I tell my students this all the time. The United States has to have this $700 billion defense budget, even in times of peace, because we have to plan for every potential opponent for the next 50 years. And if we want to be ready for them, we need to start buying the stuff and doing the training now for the threat that's maybe 10, 15 years off. And we have to do that for all potential threats we can even imagine. In retrospect, it's going to look super wasteful because only one path is going to come true. Right? But we have to prepare because we don't know which one it's going to be. Right? China does not have to do that. All they have to do is catch up with the United States. It's a heck of a lot more efficient. Okay, so I hope I've scared you. Let's use a few minutes, however much time you can spare for questions. I'm sorry, but to ask a professor to speak for a short period of time is always a fool's errand. So, questions from the audience that I haven't already fielded? Yes, sir.
Familiar with this idea of the fourth turning and the fact that we're in this high potential conflict time. I hadn't thought of Ukraine as being invaded in '08, but he sets the beginning of the fourth turning around '08 with the Great Financial Crisis.
Yeah.
What are you stopping that?
I'm not a huge fan of these meta-historical kind of frameworks. They tend, obviously all theories simplify, but I think something like that, there's so much that gets simplified into it. And I'm always wary of frameworks and metaphors and especially analogies that make us think too quickly through something, right? You'll often hear an analogy in the policy world that, if we stop defending Ukraine now, that's like the Munich appeasement, right? The Munich appeasement of Hitler, and look what happened after that. We should never have done that. And so we've got to do this, this, and this. I agree that we do need to keep supporting Ukraine, but we should not base it on analogies that are not very closely tied together, right? Analogies are a mental shortcut, and it makes us think more quickly, but we also tend to overlook the important differences. So this is something kind of famously that John F. Kennedy was demanding that his ex-com think differently about during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Let's not try to compare this to something that we've all experienced before because this is new. So I'm not, no offense to the author, of course, but I think maybe that it's just too broad characterization to be useful, and sometimes things like that can even be dangerous. Like, I'm sure you've heard the term, we don't negotiate with terrorists, right? Or even we don't negotiate with the sponsors of terrorists. Okay, but we were able to negotiate with the Soviet Union at the peak of the Cold War twice. Cuban Missile Crisis, and then again under, of all people, Ronald Reagan, right? The ultimate Cold Warrior, who built the defense budget that we have today. He made nuclear arms reduction deals with the Soviets while we were at each other's throats around the world. Right? So these kind of broad truisms about, we don't negotiate with the enemy, it's all or nothing. I think they're risky. Yes?
Another ending question. Why would the Jews be worth the squeeze for Taiwan?
Yeah. So I guess if you're looking economically, the juice is the semiconductor industry, right? Which is less and less of an advantage over the years. I mean, both the US and China have made movements toward improving our own semiconductor production capacity with kind of some hits and misses on that. But yes, Taiwan supplies a massive share of the world's semiconductors. It is a tech hub in other ways too. for networking technology and other things. But I don't think it's about the economic argument for China in this case as much as it is the kind of geopolitical position that Taiwan is too deeply tied to the reputation of China. They've said too much about it to back away now. Even if it was less physically valuable, I think they would still stick to their guns about it. And where you see China react the most hostilely to Taiwan is in the times when Taiwan has talked about Taiwanese identity as being different from being Chinese. The DPP, the not really pro-democracy anymore, but the opposition party to the most powerful KMT party in Taiwan, the DPP, they tend to be a little more pro-independence than the KMT is. And when they were in power last time in the parliament, they enacted a national referendum asking people, do you identify as Taiwanese or do you identify as Chinese? Right? Now, it wasn't a majority who said Taiwanese, but the numbers were high enough that China got freaked out. And I think that's where the real struggle is. China has committed itself to this idea that the people in Taiwan are Chinese, that Taiwan is Chinese. They've said it too much. They've made it too much of their strategy. And even if it's not worth taking anymore, actually it would hurt them to take it in some ways because they trade with Taiwan quite actively, despite being geopolitical rivals. I think they're still aiming for it. And if I had to make a prediction on this one, I'd say no war yet, but war in my lifetime. And then we have to decide, do we want to be part of that or not?
I guess the economic challenges China's having now is also galvanizing.
Well, I've heard both stories on that. I talk with our Chinese expert a lot, and she has the view that it would be too expensive right now, even if they had the tactical capabilities, it'd be too expensive right now for them to start a war. So that's why she thinks it's going to take longer. My analysis is that it's more about the being able, the logistics and the tactics of it. They're not quite there yet. These are proof of concept. They only have 2 of these things, right? So I don't think they've demonstrated that they can take it successfully, but 20 years out, I think so. Yeah. And I'm not alone in thinking that. Richard Betts, who's one of the most famous, small-time famous political scientists, said that this is where he expects World War III to start.
It was interesting to me that Pence said came out and said explicitly that we defend Taiwan, which I thought was sort of, I know Biden said it, someone everybody else walked it back. I don't feel like China really reacted to that, and I'd be curious to your thoughts. The other thing is, watching the Ukrainian siege drones, if I was China, I'd be very, think about how rough it would be anyways. Whatever Ukraine has been able to do with the siege drones would make it extremely difficult for China to come across.
Yeah.
Taiwan is making this.
I would love to be in the room with the translator to know what China's making of the war in Ukraine. I'd love to know what lessons they're drawing from it. I hope they're drawing some lessons that will deter them, show that an overpowered country can defend itself pretty successfully. Taiwan has an inescapable problem, though, which is that it has no strategic depth. Ukraine has a lot of Ukraine to back into and keep fighting. Taiwan doesn't have anything to back into. I was there in, I think, 08 maybe, 09, something like that. And I went to their war college, the equivalent of their war college. And they gave this long presentation to those of us in the audience about the various defensive zones of Taiwan and when they'll know this and how fast they'll be able to react. And I think we all walked away thinking that none of that's enough time. They don't have enough time. If something happens, it's too late because there's nowhere to retreat to. And that they can't fix with technology, but I think they can make it hurt if they're alone. If we join them, then it's a real war. Yeah, then it's the big deal, Pacific Fleet, the whole thing. Okay, and I think we have these challenges in answering all the questions you're asking, right? That we are distracted We are juggling 15,000 plates in the air, trying to keep them all spinning at once, and our leaders are still human beings. They have limits to what they can perceive and understand all at once. And you can see that message control right now isn't tight, right? The fact that Hegseth is saying something that maybe Trump didn't specifically approve, right? And rumor has it that they're having a hard time finding aides to work with Hegseth right now because he's a difficult personality. The fact that, we will have a different president after the next electoral cycle, and everybody knows that, right? So our electoral system is sometimes a weakness in our perceived ability to stay the course. And I'd say within this 4-year period, I think we're extremely unpredictable right now, which of course is bad for business, but also bad for foreign affairs. Any last questions? Yeah.
Yeah, just kind of ending on that. I mean, I was thinking about, 300 years ago or whatever in the United States, where like, you really don't have these English people or whatever. Are there any, we talk about the same geographies every time, it's kind of the hotspots. I'm like,
Yeah.
Clearly not escalated to the same degree, but like, who are our frenemies right now? You know what I mean? Like, I'm just kind of curious, like, can they go here again? I'm not sure, like, what are they going to do about it? Or, I mean, just curious if there's any, when you think about these things out that we're preparing for outside of the ones that everyone knows we're preparing for, they sort of stand up in Europe or anywhere else in the world.
Well, we're in a bizarre time in terms of our alliances in particular, right? Our allies are not always on the same wavelength as we are when it comes to what the threats are, how serious they are, how much it's worth to spend on these things. And there's been talk before the Ukraine war that maybe NATO would disintegrate, for instance, because the original threat that was the cause of it being formed was gone. And it coincided with the time where the US kind of turned inward for a while and showed less interest in those matters. But I think we are fortunate in that the American system that has been built since World War II benefits many, many more countries than it harms. And even for the countries that are maybe not completely supportive of all of the principles of it, they benefit enough economically and in terms of global stability that it makes no sense for them to jump ship. Right? We have built, whether on purpose or not, we've built a very inclusive, broadly beneficial system that I would argue is superior to the British system that came before it, the British imperial system, in terms of spreading out the goods, the wins. And so even when they disagree with us, our allies, I think, largely will stay on board. First, there's no good alternative, and second, they're getting more than they're losing. If we voluntarily stop providing those benefits over time, then that will change. Right? And I'm not a trade person, but I know a heck of a lot of trade people and economists. And I'll say, for instance, that the tariff policies that we're flirting with, they are a step back from providing a public good to the rest of the international system in the form of the American market. Right? Something that has been crucial in keeping them on board. So I think we can inflict some damage on ourselves if we choose to do it. But short of that, the Chinese alternative to our system doesn't exist. The Russian alternative to our system doesn't exist. Right? And Europe is a long, long way away from caring enough about our differences to try to change these rules of the road.
I was thinking about this too, like Steve, they've stolen plenty of secrets and stuff like that. And
Yeah. But we ourselves admit that we spy on everybody except for 5 countries. And guess what? We spy on them too.
Big picture question. I think we all have a tendency to think that geopolitics gets more complex by the week. Is that really true, or is that just recency bias covering up the fact that the world's always been a messy place?
Sure, I think you're right. It's recency bias, right? For instance, with technological change, everybody's talking about AI and all of that. And then before that, it was, the internet's going to change everything. We're going to get haircuts online and whatever. AI is alarming, and I almost made it another bullet point up here. But if you think about an exponential curve, right, and the mathematical properties of a process that's changing at an exponential rate is that at every point on the curve, it's exponential. So if you look at only your little piece of the curve, it always looks like you're at the inflection point. So we tend to overestimate how important our time is compared to other times in this broader trend of change in the world. Oh, these are the crucial times. These are the decisions that are going to really impact the next 100 or next 1,000 years. And people thought that in the past too, right? And they will continue to think about themselves that way in the future. So yeah, it's not more complex than it has been before. I don't think the stakes are more existential than they were before. But we do have to be willing to pivot and become experts in new things every year in order to stay on top of all of these changes. Right? If we stick with the lens that we grew up with, whenever that was, we're all in big trouble. Last one, I promise, yes.
I'm reading your second bullet here. I did hear on a podcast lately that I guess the Trump administration is going to take down intelligence capabilities. Is that true? Kind of.
Yeah, yes. I mean, not like big picture destruction of our intelligence gathering ability, but the first time we've willingly cut back on it, not as a strategic reorientation. Like there does not appear to be like a game plan for why certain people would be dismissed from the intelligence agencies right now. And loyalty, yeah. I have many former students, one of whom has been at the CIA for 15 years now, who I talk to casually and very broadly about things at work. She said that it's bizarre because people who are below her in seniority are not getting cut, and people who have 25 years of experience are getting cut because they just changed career titles, which made them probationary under federal employment, which meant that they were feasible, they were allowed to be dismissed. So we're getting rid of expertise that really we have no reason to get rid of. And honestly, I think that's all just penny wise and pound foolish. And even if they're just gone for 6 months and we want to hire them all back, well, do you know anybody who can afford to be unemployed for 6 months? Do you know anybody who would rush back to their old employer who summarily dismissed them without cause just because the job opens up again? No, those people are gone. They're gone. And that's a major loss.
I hate to ask this as the last question for anyone, but do you worry, I mean, Trump's the first truly has taken what I would consider should be sort of a career path, less politically sensitive, and getting rid of expertise for what, to me, that is an autocratic tendency. And your whole point of why Putin's in trouble, I would argue why a lot of these are related. Basically, you get rid of good people because they're not specifically loyal to you. How much are you worried about that?
I think it's a 50-year impact of this short period, no matter what happens next. So I'm very worried about it. I'm worried about what I see my own students deciding to do now. My best and brightest students, the ones who really worked with me and took 3 or 4 classes with me and talked with me about job paths, those used to be people that I could expect to be going into intelligence agencies, the Foreign Service, USAID, these other really service occupations that are underpaid but do a lot of important things for the country. And I felt good about being a tiny part of that story. And now those best and brightest, they have no interest in federal service. It's not stable anymore. It's not respected in the same way it was, at least in the highest levels of government. So why would they want to do that? I think it is a major loss, and I think we could be hamstringing ourselves. I don't know that any particular country desk or regional desk or analysis branch of the agencies, I don't know that they've been wiped out completely. But we have lost important heads. And they're not going to come back, is my view. So it's a big problem. It's the number one priority for whoever is next in government, I would say, is to rebuild that capacity. Years ago, George Tenet, who wasn't my favorite CIA director, but he said, if we want to prepare after 9/11 to be able to gather intelligence in the Middle East again, using our own people, that's going to take us at least 10 years to build up that capacity. Right? And it really did take that long. And we're not talking about just one region anymore. So that's, yeah, I don't have to fix these problems, thank goodness. But yeah, that one's a hair on fire kind of thing. Okay, I've alarmed everyone. Thank you. Thanks very much.